Time to have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. We do that with our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, who today wants to have a look, Jim, you want to have a look at ideas and how they sort of get around, and they get around the entire world of politics sometimes.
Well, yes, Mark, I guess the key thing here that I'd like to sort of focus on is the way in which ideas, political strategies, and various practices circulate, take root, and have impact in different parts of the world. So, for example, the way in which the Australian Constitution and parliamentary system was set up owes a good deal to the UK, of course, because that was the sort of colonising country. But it also owes something to the US, where the constitutional delegates in Australia in the 1890s looked to the US for a model of what might apply to the Australian situation. Hence, we get a Senate and a House of Representatives, but we don't get a Bill of Rights because they decided that that wasn't needed in a British-oriented country. All of that sort of, I suppose one could say, in a positive vein. We also get, for example, through the from the 80s through to the present, practices in Australia, particularly electoral strategies of political parties and their way in which they frame campaigns, have been very instrumental. For example, when the Hawke government was elected, people from within the Hawke government were then consulted, shall we say, by the Blair-led Labor Party to develop a strategy for a successful election. And it took till 1997 to get that strategy in place, but it basically drew heavily on the Australian Labor Party strategy and electoral programs of the 1980s. Similarly, the British, currently, the Conservative government in the UK, is looking very closely at a number of strategies that the successive Australian governments used, in particular the turn back the boat strategy, the offshore detention system and so forth. And perhaps more malignly, I suppose, Mark, is the way in which quite a few practices from the US are circulating and attempting to take root within the Australian political culture and the Australian political system. The strategy, for example, of the Republican Party over several decades now, so at least probably first articulated and failed with Barry Goldwater in the 80s, but come the...
Gee, there's the name from the past.
The 60s. Sorry. By the 80s, they had perfected their electoral strategy somewhat with Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. And that sort of unfolded. But as those decades unfolded into the 21st century, the Republican Party took a much more hostile stance to, in a sense, stymieing the institutions of government by taking a more or less negative approach, basically saying we're against big government, but in practice it became we're just against government. And instead of getting a sort of bipartisan approach to various important things, they began to be much more polarised in that approach.
But the word bipartisan, though, which is a great word, but sometimes that can be tricky because you do have bunches of people that are generally opposed, have differing views. I mean, if you're on one side, on a lot of things, you generally have the opposite view to people on the other side. So sometimes that can be tricky to achieve.
Oh, it certainly is. And that it's I think, one of the issues of developing bipartisan approaches is recognising that there is common ground. What has been happening, I think, in the past couple of decades, but in particular in the past decade, Mark, is that the common ground is rapidly disappearing. So the polarisation is far more radically pronounced, and the ability to reach common ground becomes extremely difficult. And I think we saw this play out in the election of the Abbott government in 2013, where a strategy borrowed from the Republicans of being, shall we say, just say no to everything and oppose everything and do not cooperate on anything and simply attack the government no matter what.
But I think that their
was
strategy,
successful.
but I think their strategy was simplified. If nothing else, it was like, here's 2 or 3 core messages, and every time that we're up on the TV or on the paper, these are the 3 or 4 messages, and you really will have the opportunity to be for or against them. It did work.
Oh,
It
exactly,
did work.
but unfortunately for successive coalition governments following that, including the Abbott-led government, was they weren't prepared to govern. They had good strategies, if you want to put it that way. They had successful strategies in how to destabilise those that were governing. But once they got into government, then it became far harder, because the strategy of just opposing suddenly becomes, well, this doesn't work when you're actually in government. You have to adopt a wider, broader type of approach. Yes, you're still focused on the things that you believe in and the policies that you want to see happen, but you're governing for the whole of the country, not just simply for the bandwidth that happened to
It's a very interesting point, because I think that in the essence of what you're saying, you're right. And to be fair, the Liberals had a couple of very dud leaders after that. Turnbull, useless. Morrison, I think everybody ended up hating him. But if you look at, say, the Labor Party now, if you're talking about looking at, we're just going to cover 1 or 2 major points and just hammer that home, what happens to a leader if all of a sudden the tide turns and that issue is no longer massively in favour? Like, if you look at, say, polling at the moment, a lot of polls would suggest that the Voice is not going to happen, whether you're for it or not. If that was to go down, where does the leader sit on that, who has basically hitched his star very much to that wagon?
That's very difficult to answer in a sense, because it would depend in part on a number of other issues that the leader is associated with. I don't think necessarily leaders rise or fall on just one single issue. Sometimes it happens that way, but I think
John Howard, GST both times.
Yes, but with the GST didn't lose government the first time round.
Well, no, that's true, but it certainly won it for the other guys. That's true.
Yeah. So coming back to that though, Mark, the thing with the Albanese government is, and the strategy of the Dutton-led coalition, is that no matter what Albanese puts up, what the government does, no matter how good or mediocre, whatever, the merits of the case no longer apply. The strategy of the opposition is to oppose, and to do so loudly. So the government might say, we've got success, we've just got some successful policies in place that we can see they're working, etc., and they might list them off, and they'll be very proud of it. But the opposition can easily turn around and say, but yes, what about? You're not doing anything about X, or you haven't done enough on Z. So they can pick stuff that's also not part of the...
Yeah, that's true, but it's also at the moment a very easy... It's low-hanging fruit for the opposition, because the government is certainly perceived to be doing nothing on cost of living, because people go, well, you're the government, why my interest rates up? Why
one might ask how they're perceived to do in that way, Mark, because I think... It's if one looks at some of the measures and policies that the government's announced over the past, let's just say 6 months, they're doing stuff, but it's not bearing, shall we say, immediate results. And secondly, a lot of it's invisible to the ordinary citizen, and so it's relatively
That proves your
easy.
point, though, doesn't it? If something's invisible, if it's not those core things right up front, it doesn't matter how good it may or may not be if it's not having an effect.
Yeah, I guess, and the question is then, for the government, is how do they make what they're doing visible? And it's very difficult to get successful stuff into a media space that people will take notice of. It's far easier to get a sort of confrontational issue in front of people, because it generates news, it attracts people's attention. So the negatives are often far easier for people to perceive, because they're the ones that get put in front of them on a sort of, shall we say, a regular and a daily basis. The struggle for any government is to have its successes recognised, because the successes aren't necessarily confrontational and newsworthy in the sense of generating controversy and wanting people to click on it in the digital space, or even to sort of read newspapers about it, or to turn on the television to watch news bulletins about those sorts of things. But a crisis or some form of confrontation people say, oh, what's going on here? We need to look at that. So various measures that the government might have put in place to ease the cost of living are slowly, from their perspective, coming into play, but we're not going to be seeing how successful they are for some time. Meanwhile, if you happen to be the leader of the opposition, you've got a range of opportunities to keep hammering that it's not happening because it's not actually affecting people in the way that would register with them at this stage.
Yeah, some may even argue the point it's easier to be an opposition leader than be in government, which may very well the current Prime Minister is finding out.
Well, I think that's a sort of truism in politics. It's a lot easier to lead an opposition. It may not be easy to win government, but it's a lot easier to portray the government as not competent or not doing what they say they're going to do, or that they've broken this promise or that promise, when, for the most part, some of the ironies of the opposition's criticisms of the current government are that the current government is attempting to deal with issues that are long-standing, that have been plaguing successive governments, not just simply the current ALP government. But when you're the opposition, you can short-circuit history and pretend that it's not a long-term problem and simply say, well, this is a government who can't cope, who can't manage, etc. So those sorts of things are particularly pronounced in various ways. And part of it, I just wanted to quickly say before we wrap up, Mark, part of the stuff that's coming out of the US that's feeding into opposition strategy here depends on our political culture. And I suspect, on a positive note, our political culture is quite different in many ways, despite the similarities. And it's that dimension that I think will enable some of the more pernicious dimensions of this circulation of political strategies that are more negative to be, to some extent, attenuated and allow our politicians to sort of come more towards the centre, shall we say, into more to the common ground. In many respects, they have much more in common than they publicly acknowledge.
All right, Jim, it's a nice sort of a day. I'm going to let you get out there and enjoy it. As always, thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Mark. See you next time.
Awesome stuff. Our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.